Ooh, start recording.
All right, I believe we can start now. Most of us are here. So it would be great if we could do this in person, but I'm glad that at least virtually we'll be able to host Dr. Ruth de Diego-Balaguer. I probably butchered that even though I know Spanish. And she is coming to us from the Catalan Institution for Research and Advanced Studies, and also affiliated with the University of Barcelona. And she will be giving a talk today titled From Statistical Relations to Abstract Role Learning. And Jorge actually wanted to give a few sentences of introduction, so I'll give the floor to him.
Well, hello and welcome everybody. It's a pleasure for me to introduce Ruth de Diego-Balaguer, and I'm very happy to have her here. So first of all, welcome. Ruth got a degree in psychology at the University of Barcelona and a PhD at the same university, although in the meantime, she was involved with universities and research institutions in the UK, Germany, and Spain. She's been around quite a bit. Her interest in language learning and its neural basis started during her PhD and continued in her years as a postdoc in Paris at the French National Institute of Health and Medical Research. She returned to Catalonia through the very prestigious ICREA, where she's now, which is the Catalan Institution for Research, and she has consolidated her group there at the Institute of Neurosciences at the University of Barcelona through quite a bit of both national and international funding, including an ERC starring grant. She's also the current president of the Spanish Society for Experimental Psychology. Is that still true, Ruth?
Yes, yes.
So her work, as you will see through a nice overview of at least some of it today, has touched on several aspects related to the underlying neural mechanisms of language learning, both in terms of word learning and rule extraction, as well as the involvement of core cognitive processes, such as attention, especially in memory. So in this sense, I think her research is extremely interesting to many of us at Aquarora and flows nicely through some of our themes connecting language acquisition and neuroscience. The good news, which I guess many of you don't know, is that Ruth is a team member in the RCN funded project that I will be starting in December. So this is also a chance to get to know and to meet a new member of the extended Aqua family. So welcome, Ruth, and whenever you're ready.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Jorge, for the presentation. Okay, so thanks a lot for the invitation. I'm really glad I get to know you, even if it's online. It would be great if we had the opportunity to discuss in front of a coffee, which is also always nicer. But anyway, so let me start with the presentation. I'm going to share my screen now. Okay. Okay, can you see my presentation now? Yes. Okay.
Yes, but it's still in like, it's not in the presentation mode.
Yeah, can you see it now?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So I'm going to try to ask you something that probably most of you have done many times, but because you work in bilingualism and in second language learning. But let me ask you to imagine that you arrive to a faraway place, so a country where you are faced with a completely new language, something that you don't know. And the important thing here is that sometimes when we get to these places, you have no semantic information. So the only thing you have is a stream of sounds that come to your auditory system. And despite you have no meaning there, your cognitive system struggles to extract patterns of regularities in this flow of sound. So from these sounds of that arrive to your system, you eventually arrive to extract different types of information that are important to learn this language. You acquire words and grammatical rules. So these are usually considered the building pieces of language learning. And actually, classically, these two types of information have been considered as radically different. And actually, there has been many research trying to understand which are the mechanisms that allow us to learn them independently. So what are the different mechanisms that allow us to learn these two types of information? But actually myself, I have worked a lot to try to understand which is the difference between the two. Why is it that we have different mechanisms for them, and which are those different mechanisms? But what I'm going to try to do today here is to try to see actually that despite there are many different mechanisms to learn both, we can identify some mechanisms that are shared between the two. And why is it? So let me think about it for a moment. Okay, so both words and dependencies in those between those words, you extract them when you learn them from speech. You extract them from a flow of sequences of sound. So all available mechanisms in our cognitive system that track temporal information, that track sequential information, are going to be put in place in order to extract these two types of information. So if we consider this, we have to think that time is a very important aspect of how we track this information and extract the words and the rules of language. And therefore, we need to have some shared mechanisms that depend or are responsible to track sequential information and time, and consider time, that are going to be used for both rule learning and word learning. So I'm going to, today in this talk, I'm going to try to review some evidence on different mechanisms that are shared between word and rule learning. So in the talk, I'm going to first review some evidence showing that both for word segmentation, but also for the extraction of non-adjacent dependencies, you require the tracking of statistical relations. So there is a lot of work on statistical learning on word segmentation, but I will show that this is something that is also very relevant when you learn non-adjacent rules. And I will also go to review some evidence indicating that, as I was mentioning earlier, both types of learning are modulated by mechanisms of temporal tuning. So you need to take into account temporal information, and for both these types of information, we're going to see that this is important. And finally, I will finish by reviewing some evidence indicating that despite there are these shared mechanisms at these very early stages of learning, these are happening only at the superficial level, but when we need to abstract and generalize the rules that we have learned, we need some mechanisms that can be dissociated from these early mechanisms that we use and are shared with word learning. So before I go on with the talk, please, since we are not that many, I think it could be, and I cannot see you while I'm presenting, it would be great if you interrupt me. So if there is something that is not clear, or you want to ask something, please interrupt me anytime, just speaking out loud, and we can talk. Okay, so let me start by saying that all the work that I will be presenting in the presentation is part of the PhD thesis of Joan Orpella. I don't know if you can see my pointer. Can you see it?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Yes. Yeah, so Joan Orpella is the guy that I'm showing you here. He finished the PhD a couple of years ago, and he's a very talented researcher who is now doing his postdoc at NYU. So the work I will be presenting was part of his PhD thesis. And in the first part of the talk, I will review some work to show that in order to extract non-adjacent rule, you require the tracking of statistical relations. And this was work that was developed in collaboration also with Ernest Maserrero, who is now working with us in Barcelona, but while we were doing this work, he was a postdoc in McGill. Okay, so many of you probably are familiar with work that has been developed in statistical learning. Jenny Safran did the seminal work on that, showing that we use statistical information, we use statistical learning in order to segment words in speech. And actually, during this early work and some of her papers, she mentioned what I'm quoting here, that statistical learning capitalizes on the statistical properties of the language environments, and including the distribution of sounds in words and the order of word types in sentences. So what I'm quoting here is important because many of the research that has been developed for many, many years on statistical learning was focusing on word segmentation, which has been very, very productive and very important for our understanding of word learning. But even at this early work, Jenny Safran already mentioned that statistical learning can be very important also to extract other types of information from speech. So not only word segmentation, but also for the acquisition of grammatical relations. Statistical learning is the ability to extract this pattern of occurrences that occur in our environment. So not only in the context of language, but in whatever kind of stimulation that we have around us. And in all the work that has been developed, it has been shown that human adults and also infants, but also other non-human animals, they can use this type of information to segment words from a stream of syllables. So in this kind of experiments, we present a sequence of a stream of syllables that is presented, as a continuous speech stream. And syllables are organized so that we can segment words, because the probability of one syllable following the other within a word is higher than the probability of two syllables that occur at the edge between the words. So by computing these type of transitional probabilities, we are able to locate where the word boundaries are in the speech stream. And this kind of experiments, what is usually done, and this is important for what I will be talking about in my presentation, what is done is that after listening passively to this stream of syllables, participants are presented with two alternative word choice. So they are presented with words and paired words, so words that are not well segmented in the speech stream, and participants need to say which of the two and they consider a possible word in the language they just listen to. So the thing that is important is that actually in the research that has been developed, what has been shown is that statistical learning can be applied not only for segmentation based on the calculation of, or the computation of transitional probabilities between adjacent syllables. But what is important here is that you can also track a non-adjacent dependencies or non-adjacent statistical relations that allow us to segment speech. So for example, in this kind of speech stream where you have variability in the syllables that occur within a word, the adjacent transitional probability between the syllables is very low, right? So using only the adjacent probability, you wouldn't be able to segment the words in this speech stream. However, because there is a high probability of co-occurrences between non-adjacent dependencies, you are also able to use this information to locate where is the word boundary in this kind of speech stream. So why is this important? because we know that this information is helpful not only to segment speech, but we know that non-adjacent relations characterize the kind of dependencies that occur in language, in grammatical in non-adjacent grammatical relations. So for example, here we have in morphosyntax some examples. In different languages, you can see the same thing where you have non-adjacent dependencies. You can have this also between grammatical categories, and even at a more abstract level, you can also have non-adjacent dependencies between between grammatical categories in hierarchical structures. So it's very important to understand whether you can use this kind of statistical information to track these non-adjacent dependencies. So in order to study statistical learning mechanisms for non-adjacent dependencies, it's very important to be able to not only have a test at the end, so what has been done so far, but if you want to really track what happens during the learning process, you should have some kind of measure of how participants are learning throughout the learning process. So not only testing whether they learn or not at the end, but following how the learning is evolving through the learning phase. So what we did in order to have this kind of information was to change a little bit the paradigm that was previously used and present participants with 3-word sentences in an artificial language where we have this kind of non-adjacent dependencies. We included high variability between the words that were part of the dependency, and we had a very high so a deterministic relation between the first and the last word of the sentence, so that there was a non-adjacent relationship between the first and the last word in the sentence. And based on the first word, one could easily predict what was the identity of the last word in the sentence. In this experiment, what we did was to have 2 different conditions. In one condition, participants had this kind of sentences, one after the other, and they were asked only to track one target word that appeared in the screen. And they had to say whether this target word that was presented on the screen was present or not in the sentence that they just heard. So a very simple task that was completely orthogonal to our interest. We didn't inform the subject about the presence of rules within this condition. And the idea was that if participants were able to learn the rule incidentally, we should see that the reaction times to detect the target should progressively decrease with exposure to the sentences in this language. In another condition, that was a control condition, what we did was to have also the same task, but in this case, the appearance of the target word could not be predicted based on the previous word. So they could also say whether yes or no a target was present, but in this case, they could not prepare the response based on any previous information because there was no prediction that was possible with this stimulation. So 3-word sentences, but with variable information in the first and second position of the sentence. So as I was saying, this is what we were expecting, that in the rule condition, we should expect that the reaction times should progressively decrease, whereas in the no rule condition, this should be more or less flat, or there should be a less steep decrease in the reaction times, since they could not predict compared to the rule condition. So one way to tackle whether the learning of non-adjacent dependencies engages in this kind of statistical learning mechanism, so predictive processes, is to test whether a reinforcement learning model, which is based on the updating of predictions that are progressively updated based on the mismatch between the expected and the actual stimulation that the participants receive, can really mimic the trial by trial changes in behavior of the subjects while they are learning these non-adjacent dependencies. So in this study, what we did was to use a temporal difference model, which is a reinforcement learning model that takes into account. So we specifically use this kind of model that we thought that was very good to be adapted to what the characteristic of the non-adjacent dependencies, because it takes into account the distance between the elements that are related to each other. So not the updating of the information is not considers, so gives more or less weight based on the distance between the elements that are presented. So since here we had the dependency between non-adjacent dependencies, and we had a high probability in the elements that were between the first and the last word, that was perfectly suited to what we wanted to model in these non-adjacent dependencies. The other thing that we did in this study was also to try to investigate which brain structures were related to this kind of updating of predictions that we use when we are extracting these non-adjacent dependencies based on statistical learning. So what we observed was what we expected for the reaction times. We saw that there was a steeper decrease in the reaction times for the rule condition compared to the condition with no rules. And what we have here are the reaction times, so the transformation of the reaction times on a trial by trial basis. So you can see that there is some variability, but there is these changes in the reaction times that are, following an asymptote at the end, where you have the decrease of the reaction times. And what you see here is the temporal difference model. So you can see that the model quite nicely mimics the behavior of the subjects in their reaction times to predict the appearance of the target. So with the appearance based on the rule that they extracted. So if we take the parameter of the model of the updating of the information, so the parameter that is used, so varies the value based on the updating of information, we could see which are the brain structures that are related to this updating process. And what we see is that this is related basically or mainly to the activation in the basal ganglia. So in the striatum, the putamen and the caudate are highly correlated, have a highly correlated activity with the variation of this updating on a trial by trial basis. You have also some correlation with the superior temporal gyrus, which is quite interesting because it goes in the direction to think that there is a network that relates how this updating influences how the auditory cortex is going to process the incoming stimulation. And it fits quite well with the previous literature that has shown how the basal ganglia is related to statistical learning in artificial grammar learning or in statistical learning used for the segmentation of words in the speech stream. So in those previous studies, there was these reports of activation in the basal ganglia, but here what we see with this study is an explanation of what is the mechanistic underlying source of the involvement of this structure, which is quite interesting. So from this study, we see that it supports the idea that statistical learning is also used when you need to track non-adjacent dependencies. So not only for word segmentation, but also for these non-adjacent dependencies.
Ruth, and may I just ask a real quick question?
Yes, sure.
So for the brain, you did like a whole brain analysis, and you looked for brain areas which where activation decreases towards the end of the experiment, like with decreasing.
No, so from the model you have different parameters that vary and that are used to match the model with the reaction time of the subjects. Mm-hmm. And one of these parameters is the parameter that updates, based on whether you have a match or a mismatch from what you expect and what happens. So here we use this parameter as a regressor at the whole brain to see which are the brain areas that vary the activation as a function of how this parameter varies as well.
Of like the prediction error sort of.
Exactly, yes.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so in the following part, I'm going to argue. So in order to look at more evidence that go in the direction to see that there are some mechanisms that are shared between word and rule learning. I'm going to review some evidence on how word and rule learning abilities are modulated by correct time tuning in time. And the work that I will be reviewing here was developed in collaboration with David Popple Labs, and in particular, Florencia Saneo, who was at the time a postdoc in her lab. And this is the nice thing about conferences. We met in one conference, we started to discuss, and that's how we started this very nice collaboration where we have developed several things together. And now Florencia is in Mexico, and some of the students that were working with me, Pablo, who was a postdoc, and Joan, who did his PhD with me, are now in David Popple's lab in New York. So this is some of the work that we did together in that in that particular topic. So yeah, let me go back to what I said to the beginning. So why is it that we can think that temporal tuning is important for both word segmentation and non-adjacent dependency learning? So what I was saying at the beginning is that, of course, you are extracting this from the speech stream, which means that you track the information in time, and you need to track how this different sequence of sounds that contain different types of information are going to be different, occur at different moments in time, and are going to have different durations. So now if we see here, the moment where different units of the speech stream occur, you can see that syllables, words, and phrases have different durations. So they occur at different frequencies. And what we know is that our cortical activity is going to be tuned to follow each of these different types, these different units, having different oscillatory activities that are tuned to the specific frequencies of these units. What is important here to take into account is not only this, but also that if we look at the oscillatory activity, we know that the phase of this oscillatory activity is going to determine how well the incoming stimulation is going to be processed. So for example, we know that if one stimulation occurs when the phase is here, this is going to be at a low efficiency for processing, and the information is not going to be processed as well as if it happens in the high processing at the moment where you have the increase of the phase. So if the incoming stimulation occurs at the moment is aligned with the moment where you have the phase of the oscillatory activity occurring, this information is going to be processed much better than if it happens here. And it's going to be processed a bit worse if it happens in the middle of this oscillation, or the phase of the oscillation. So this is what is a description just completely passively, but what we also know, and this is important, is that our auditory cortex is usually aligned to the stimulation that we have from speech, and the phase of this oscillatory activity is going to be modulated by other areas. So for example, we know that the prefrontal cortex has an influence on the oscillatory activity of the auditory cortex, such that it can reset the phase to occur at a different time. So it can modulate when is the phase occurring. And And so having, so for example, by having an attentional influence, you can modulate how this prefrontal cortex is going to influence the phase of the auditory cortex. So why is it important? So we know that if we look at other studies that we developed in the past on word segmentation, we know that the connectivity between the auditory and the frontal cortex is quite important in relation to word learning. So we know that functional and structural connectivity between those areas is going to be related to how well participants learn. Yeah. So in these two alternative for choice that we have at the end of the phase. So how is it that we are able to have an integration between the information that we have in the auditory cortex, and how does the prefrontal cortex influence and the way that we process in the auditory cortex. In order to understand this, since we so far have used a two alternative for choice, we need to know what happens when we are trying to learn. So what happens between those two areas, or what happens in the different networks that are involved in the learning process, such that it allows us to learn better by, enhancing the way that these two areas are connected. So since we have the knowledge that a better synchronization, so a better alignment between the auditory activity and the incoming stimulation is the key that is going to help us to encode much better the information, we can have the hypothesis that a better alignment of the auditory cortex with the incoming stimulation is going to be the key that is going to explain the individual differences that we observe in the subject. So how well the auditory cortex and the prefrontal cortex are going to be aligned. So the motor areas and the auditory areas are going to be, synchronized, is going to help us see how, we can explain the individual differences that we observed here. So what we did here was to have the same kind of very classic paradigms that are used in statistical learning, where you have a stream of syllables that is presented, and we have these statistical relations between the syllables so that we can segment based on the higher or lower transitional probability. But then in order to study whether the auditory to motor synchronization is the key point for this learning, what we asked the participants to do was we developed a task that allows us to measure how well participants were synchronizing their motor cortex with the auditory cortex. And that was a very simple task where we asked participants to simply utter the syllable ta, so saying ta, 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 at the same frequency of occurrence of the syllables that they were hearing, so that we could measure how well participants were aligning their production, so their motor activity, to the auditory activity that they were hearing. So it was an indirect way to measure how well these two informations were aligned. With the idea that if a better synchronization was related to learning, so we could see whether, participants that were better synchronized should be better learners, and participants that were less synchronized should be worse learners. So in that particular experiment, we had one condition where the syllables were presented in random order, so there was no words that could be learned, so it was just a stream of syllables that was presented. And in this case, we were measuring and the synchronization, the alignment of the uterine syllables by the subjects and the syllables that they were hearing, and another condition where they were passively listening to the syllables and learning, so a classical learning condition. So by doing this, what we saw, and that was quite surprising for us at the beginning, was that from the whole big sample that we tested, we could systematically see, because we have done it in several studies, and in this one we also tested several samples of subjects. You could always see that there are two different distribution of subjects. So one distribution of subjects that was very good, high synchronizer, and the other condition and another group of subjects that were low synchronizers. And if you take those two groups and then you ask them to do the learning of or the word segmentation task without saying anything, just passively listening to the sentences, the syllables, what you can see is that the high synchronizers were better word segmentation. They did a better word segmentation than the low synchronizers. So the question is, how is it that they were doing this? So we know, so by doing this, we can see that those that were better synchronized in the motor and auditory cortices, they were better learners. But why? What were they doing? How was their brain responding while they were learning? So if you take these two groups of subjects and you extract different brain networks that are engaged while they are doing the task, you can see that there are several that are engaged. I'm here simplifying the information because we did an independent component analysis where we extracted the different networks that were involved while doing the task. And then we looked at which ones were having a different engagement when we compared the high synchronizers and the low synchronizers. What we saw here is that actually in this specific network, in the frontoparietal network with a left lateralization, with a greater left lateralization, we saw that this network was the main one differentiating the two groups, indicating that it's actually this network that is related to how well participants are able to synchronize these two, their motor and auditory cortex. And actually the engagement of this network was correlated to how well they were synchronizing their motor activity and the information they were hearing. So the sequence of syllables. So as a summary of what I'm presenting here, so we saw that there were two groups, high and low synchronizers, and high synchronizers were better word learners, and they engaged more than the other group, a left frontoparietal network during the process of learning. So this is for word segmentation. What happens if we look at non-adjacent dependency learning? So in another study, what we did was to ask participants to do the same as in the other experiment that I presented previously. So they were hearing sentences with non-adjacent dependencies between the words, and we asked them to say whether a target word was present or not in each sentence, so that we could measure the learning of the rule incidentally by measuring their decrease of reaction times through the presentation of the sentences. And again, we had the control condition with no rules. So this is what we expected again. So in this case, what we wanted to see was what was the network that was related to this better, learning of the rules. So the individual differences in how well participants were temporally tuning to predict the word, which one was this network that was related to this, So in order to do that, what we did was to extract. So this is the information for the whole group. So again, we saw that those participants that sorry, the rule learning condition was, had a steeper slope than the no rule condition. And then we extracted the information for each participant. So we took this slope for each participant so that we could investigate the individual differences and see which was the network that was related to these individual differences in the extraction of this predictive information. And what we saw was a very similar network to the one that I was presenting to you before. So this frontoparietal network, lateralized mainly to the left, that was correlated with this slope in the participants. So here you have a comparison between the two conditions. So in the top part, you have the network for rule learning related to the steepness of the rule learning condition, and in the bottom you have the network for the word learning condition. And as you can see, it's pretty comparable in the two cases. So we can see that both for word segmentation and for non-adjacent dependency extraction, they both engage this left frontoparietal network, and this network appears related to those aspects that we have related to temporal tuning. So in one case, so for the segmentation, the motor to auditory synchronization is related to the engagement of this network, and the accurate temporal prediction for the upcoming dependency rules in the non-adjacent condition is also related to the same left frontoparietal network. So just to finish, in my last part, I'm going to mention that although we can see that there are these shared mechanisms that are, and I think it's very important to take into account these shared mechanisms, we can also see that those mechanisms can be dissociated from other mechanisms that are more specific to what we need when we learn non-adjacent dependencies, because as we all know, learning a dependency is not only knowing that those there are some elements that at the superficial level occurring one after the other, so one predicts the other, but we also need to have an abstract representation of this in order to be able to generalize this rule, which is the characteristic of a rule. Otherwise, it's not really a rule in terms of what we consider an abstract rule. Okay, so these are these are some examples of these non-adjacent rules. So these non-adjacent rules occur, in different contexts at the superficial level, but and we can extract, we can predict the upcoming elements. We have seen in the previous parts of my talk how this occurs, extracting this statistical information, and these predictions, I'm not going to go into the details of this, but I want to mention it anyway. These predictions occur for two different aspects of what happens. When we learn these kind of predictions, we not only learn that some elements are occurring with some other elements at the superficial level. So we don't only know that some phonological forms co-occur together, but we also learn that these elements occur in a certain order. So there is some information about time that is going to also be associated and has to be learned as well when we learn those dependencies. So we have to learn which element predicts which element, and also when this predictive element occurs once we have detected that this first, predictive element has appeared. So if we want to generalize this information, it's very important that we integrate these two types of information so that we can generalize it to new languages or new material that follows the same kind of rules. So in this case, for example, imagine this example of Spanish. So we have a pretty similar rule where we have the plural that occurs pretty similar at the end of the noun. So it's relatively easy to transfer the information that we know from one language to the other just by detecting that some elements occur at the same position. So in time, they are co-occurring at the same moment in time than in the other language. And we only need to transfer the information that we know from this abstract information to the phonological form of this new language. So here, from the extraction of information about the content and when this happens, we can create some abstract representation of this rule, and then we can match, when we learn a new language, we can match the information to be able to generalize it, to learn this new rule much faster than if we have to learn it from scratch. So in order to study whether we can dissociate these abstraction and generalization mechanism to the one that is related to statistical learning, what we did was to use a similar task that I presented to you before. So we asked participants to detect the target within, several sentences that were following these non-adjacent rules. So exactly as the same. We also had blocks with rules and blocks with no rules. And our expectation was that at the first, in the initial learning phase, we should see what we already observed and I already reviewed earlier. So these steeper slope for the rule condition compared to the no rule condition. But as learning occurs, and then we are able to create this more abstract rule, we should see that we arrive to an asymptote, and we see that the reaction time in the rule condition is always faster than the no rule condition, but we don't have any steeper curve occurring. Okay, yeah, so this is just indicating to us that we have arrived to the top of our learning of the rule. Yeah, so this rule can already be consolidated because it's already, learned. So if we expect that there is some kind of generalization, what we expect is the measure of generalization should be that if you are learning a new language that follows exactly the same rule, just with new phonological forms, you won't need to go back to learning everything and show this kind of pattern, but you should see exactly the same pattern because it's like being exposed to exactly the same rule that you already learned. I don't know if everything is clear in what I'm saying here. So you expect that even though you are presented with a new language, the pattern of reaction time should be the same as if you were listening to the same language as before, because it's just, you are just transferring what you already know, and the generalization should be reflected as a behavior that is exactly the same as the previous language that you already learned. So this was our, yes.
You might get into this now, but do you expect any period of time? Do you expect that pattern to obtain straight away, or do you expect that there's some adjustment time in the time that they realize that this is in fact something that isn't analogous and that they can do the same thing?
So in this study, since we wanted to be sure that they consolidated the rule, we left some time between the learning and the generalization phase, with the idea that from previous studies we know that consolidation helps the generalization of the rule, not only in language but also in other memory studies outside the language domain. So we haven't tried, well, I'm wrong. We did try with other, we did it in other studies to use other languages and see, if participants were learning, but we didn't look at the slope. So I could check, like looking at this later, now that reanalyzing it, because this is something that we did in the new studies, but in this particular study, since we wanted to be sure that there was some consolidation to enhance, the generalization process, we left some days between the learning and the generalization. But I would, I mean, I would expect that at least this gap should help to have better generalization.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So I think that also responds Eleonora's question, who was asking whether you left a 24-hour. You left more than one day, right? Between phases. Okay.
Yeah. So I'm going to explain this now. Okay. So first of all, in that study, so we found the same, so that I previously reported. So there was this slope that was steeper for the rule condition, and we got to this asymptote in the second part. So they were tested with the same language, and then they were, they continued to be tested, after a short period, but this was exactly the same language. So here we see that we reach an asymptote, and there was a sustained difference between the rule condition and no rule condition in the second part of the learning phase. So in the second part, what we did was to take some of the participants and make them do the second part within the scanner and measure their brain activity, so that we could extract the peak of activation during this last period of learning. And then in order to test for the dissociation between the statistical learning phase and the generalization phase with a new language, what we did was to use a transcranial magnetic stimulation that allow us to apply current stimulation of, in this case, we use a repetitive transcranial stimulation protocol. It was a 1 Hz repetitive transcranial stimulation, and that allow us to stimulate for 15 minutes during the area of interest, on the area of interest, so that we can reduce the excitability of this area during a period of time where we ask participants to learn the new language. So what we wanted was to interfere with the activity of this area that we expected to be related with this generalization process. And then during the effect of the simulation, ask them to learn. So that was an offline stimulation, in the sense that we stimulated for 15 minutes, and then the effect lasted for 30 minutes while we were testing them. So they were not stimulating while they were learning. It was an effect that lasted after the stimulation. So the protocol was the following. There was this first session that I just showed you the results. In the second part, it's when they went into the scanner, and then we measured the brain activity for each individual. And we looked at the peak activation in the left parietal lobe. And then we stimulated in this area after 1 week. Yeah, so they came, we looked at the peak of stimulation, they went home, and then they came back 1 week later. And then we use a repetitive transcranial stimulation to stimulate two areas within the same subject. So one area of interest, which was this peak of activation that we detected in the first session where they came, and another area of no interest that was a control area where we stimulated, and we expected that the stimulation there should not have any effect. Yeah, so this is what we obtained. So when we stimulated in this area of no interest, we observed the generalization effect that we were expecting. This is the same that we also observed in another group of subjects that we tested as a control, just to see that without any kind of TMS in any area, we found the same generalization effect. Whereas if we stimulated in the area of interest, so within this peak of activation in the left parietal lobe, what we observed was that there was, again, a behavior that was the same as we observed when they were learning for the first time the language. So they were not able to generalize what they learned in the first session. So just to summarize what I presented in this talk. So we saw that non-adjacent rules require tracking statistical relation as reported for segmentation. And we saw that the basal ganglia has a key role in this tracking. We saw also that both learnings, so word and rule learning, are modulated by mechanisms of temporal tuning. So for this, in those cases, we see that there are shared mechanisms between word and rule learning. And those mechanisms that are shared, we saw in the second part that we can dissociate them from others that are those that are related to generalization of the rule, and can be, even if we interfere with them, the statistical learning mechanisms can still occur without generalization. So despite there are clear differences between word and rule learning, we can identify some shared mechanisms that allow to extract both words and rules from fluent speech. So why is this important? It's important because if we think about language development and also about language pathology, this is very important. So I haven't talked so much about other cognitive functions that interact with the statistical learning process, but it's very important to take into account that compared to an adult, a baby has no endogenous attention, it has no executive functions that are developed, and they have limited representations because they are building them. And this interacts with the statistical learning abilities. This is something that is different from what we see in adults. And then their learning is going to be highly driven by their statistical learning abilities that are going to allow them to create these new representations. In adults, this is different. So they do have endogenous and executive functions, they have fully formed representations, and they have a higher influence in their statistical learning abilities that are going to have an effect. And of course, so this is going to, change their representations, this is going to allow them to learn new languages using these different functions. But this is something that we need to take into account if we compare language learning in development and in adults. But it's important because those statistical learning abilities are going to be shared between rule learning and word learning. So this is going to help us to understand not only how language development occurs, but also how some pathologies may be affected, may have an effect on both word learning and rule learning if those shared mechanisms are affected. And this is also very important to understand as well the individual differences that characterize second language learning. And I'm going to finish just mentioning all the people that have worked in the different studies that I presented here, and especially Joan Orpella, because as I said, this is a work from his PhD, and other people from David Poppel's lab, and other people from Barcelona that are now in other places in Europe and in the world. Thank you very much to all of you for listening.
All right, thank you so much. A quiet virtual applause is echoing in this Zoom room as we speak. But yeah, I'd like to open the floor for questions. And maybe in the meantime, I'll consolidate my thoughts and have a few of my own. So I think Jason had his hand up.
Yes.
Yes, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
yes.
So thanks for a really interesting talk. Just a quick question about the involvement of the basal ganglia, right? So, and this is a context of kind of it's language learning, right? And it's non-native language learning, right? Do you have anything to say about what memory systems potentially are implicated here to support second language learning from this? I'm thinking in particular, if you take this as an indication that you have proceduralized memory kicking in, what this would mean for, say, Ullman's model of divide between procedural and declarative memory. And I'll hope you'll say something and then smile, if not.
Yeah, well, the thing is that it relates to many different things that are related to the basal ganglia. So not only to the distinction between declarative and procedural memory. So of course, I think that it relates to the fact that we have some procedural memory occurring there, but also in relation to implicit or incidental learning as well, that is related to the basal ganglia. So it's, I mean, it relates to all these types or models or related to implicit and procedural memory, in the sense that I think that I would cover all these within the distinction of automatic or more, automatic versus controlled processes, in the sense that the basal ganglia may be related to these more, automatic processes that need to also have some, or can be also influenced by controlled processes coming from the prefrontal cortex, because the basal ganglia have also these connections with the prefrontal cortex that can, modulate their activity. So I think that it relates to the fact that you have during learning a very important interaction between those automatic and controlled processes that, they get initially very, very automatic to, I think that there is some kind of a U shape in the learning. So for example, for the non-adjacent rule, this is what I feel it happens. You have initially a very automatic processes that are going on. You have progressively more controlled processes when you are more aware of the rules that are within the language. But then once you get used to using these rules and be more exposed to them, you again get to an automatized mode of processing of non-adjacent rules.
Can you still hear me? Yeah.
Yes, sure.
No, I get that. I'm asking this in the context specifically of, claims, and they're not inconsequential ones because they're borrowed into other fields. So for example, what Jorge is really interested in, so models of third language acquisition and kind of the assumption that that is a priori right. So, and Ullman himself talks about a difference between automation, which can happen via induction of declarative memory and then gets automatized, but that's not proceduralization, because only proceduralization can happen through the procedural memory system, right? So I was wondering really what the involvement of at such low level, right? This is really kind of first exposure type of learning that you see, at least to me, an indication that there is procedural memory kicking in and not just automation, because you don't see anything in the mediotemporal lobe, for example, that would indicate that declarative memory is really kicking in here. So, I mean, to me, it's really nice because I'd like to use it to say, well, here you have evidence from not just naturalistic in the wild, but here in a controlled context where you have some evidence that early on procedural memory is in fact part of non-native language acquisition, and therefore this distinction is spurious at best, which means, let's say, the L2 status factor and L3 acquisition that just makes an assumption that then you go to one system because all non-native systems must be declaratively learned, I think is interesting, right? So automation aside, because you could go declarative and automatize declaratively learned things, but they wouldn't change the memory system, right? So that's what I was interested in. To me, and correct me if I'm wrong, this is at least compatible with having some evidence that you have a procedural memory is important in this context of second language learning, or at least what they're doing if this is actually second language learning and not something else.
Yes.
Right? Because it is a small grammar, right?
Yeah, I think what is important also is the way that this is the way that they learn, in the sense that we have some other task that is somehow interfering with some kind of more controlled process going on, or more declarative. We are forcing them to have a learning that is incidental, and this is when probably in second language learning you are getting this this procedural learning occurring.
Uh-huh.
You know, because otherwise, I mean, there is this very close interaction between controlled processes and automatic. That's what I was at the end talking about, the distinction between first language learning or development, what happens in development and in second language learning, in the sense that these controlled processes are not occurring in first language learning in development, because they are not there. They don't have this ability. So they only have this procedural going on, because they don't have this other one. In the adults, you have this tendency of controlled processes getting in all the time. So if you have to force them somehow with some other task or something else that forces them to use this incidental learning, so that you have this procedural learning happening as in first language acquisition.
Yeah.
Okay, we have another question from Edith, if she wants to unmute.
Yeah, hi. I really like your talk. Thank you very much. And I'm really intrigued by also your, and especially in your last part, that you try to get into that cause-effect relation by stimulating people. So I was wondering, in the first part of your talk, when you talk about word segmentation and the role of being able to temporarily predict what goes on in the synchronization between your production and your auditory areas, have you also looked at these at sort of cause and effect and trying to disable parts of the brain? So for instance, I can imagine, so you can present people with distorted feedback or distorted temporary feedback, right? That messes up their whole synchronization as far as production. So would you expect that a task like that would affect people's ability to segment the words on the basis of a statistical learning task, for instance?
Yes, well, we did it in a very simple and basic way, so not so sophisticated as TMS or anything. So very with a very simple task, which is simply asking the subjects to do exactly the same task. So this blah blah blah, while they are listening to, so they are trying to learn. So what happens in this case is that you are not allowing them to use their motor system to synchronize. I mean, they are trying to synchronize, but actually the synchronization is interfering with their learning.
Oh, okay, then I misunderstood your presentation. I thought you first did that to measure people's ability to synchronize, and then did another test.
Yeah, we did that, but in another study and in another condition, we also did these other conditions. So what we observed in that other condition is that those subjects that were high synchronizers, they were very much interfered by using this kind of interference, meaning that it's actually those that really are trying to synchronize, and you are interfering with these abilities that are really having an interference. So those that do not synchronize, if you ask them to do that, their performance is the same, because they don't synchronize. So it really doesn't matter. It doesn't interfere with their learning ability. I don't know if I make myself clear.
So wait, those who do not synchronize, I mean, I thought the better synchronized were the better learners.
Yes, they are the better learners. But if you ask them to, okay, so there is one task that is the synchronization task, where you ask them to do the blah, blah, blah while they listen. But here they don't need to learn. Yes, they only listen to the syllabus, and we measure how well they synchronize. Yeah. And then there is another condition where we ask them just to, do the blah, 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 and they are trying to learn. So those participants that are really well synchronizing, they are really interfered by doing the blah, blah, blah. Yeah. In this, let's say it in this way. So their motor cortex and their auditory cortex is synchronizing even when they are not saying anything. So those guys are really good to synchronize. It's like their cortices are very well synchronized, because we see that even at the structural level. So we see differences also in how, in the arcuate fasciculus that structurally connects those areas. So, and if we test them several times and in different types of tasks, they cannot avoid being synchronized. Yeah, so if you ask them to say nothing and you allow their cortices to synchronize, they are really good learning.
Mhm.
If you ask them to do the task and you ask them to do the blah, blah, blah,
Mhm.
since they cannot, use this synchronization to learn, because you are asking them to do to use the motor cortex for something else, then they are really interfered.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, I need to go to another meeting, and I know other people have questions too. So thank you. Thank you so much, and good to see everybody. Bye bye.
Okay,
Yeah, Janina was no, actually Jillian was right before her, but she just left. So I'm just gonna read her question from the chat, Janina, and then you can ask if that's okay. So Jillian asked, she said that she was interested in the threshold at which speakers infer a rule. She would like to know whether you or your team have investigated the transition to generalization by manipulating the degree of noise or exceptions in the stimulus itself. So you can also see it in the chat if it helps to read. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, this is a question that has been, I mean, I've thought about it many times, but I haven't done it. No, so I don't know. What I can say is that we have used several levels of variability in the material that we have used, and of course, as in other studies, the more variability you introduce, the easier it is to extract the dependencies. So variability plays a role in learning, but even with low levels of variability, we still see that some participants are able to learn. There is I mean, here the issue is also on the individual differences of the subject. So it's not only that in general, they learn better, but it's also the number of subjects that are able to learn with more or less variability in the material. We have one study that we haven't published yet, where we have manipulated also the level of variability and trying to see at which point of saturating the memory you shift from learning rules to declarative memory, in the sense that remembering all the exemplars that you are presenting. But I don't know if this answers the question.
Unfortunately, we can't ask Jillian, but yeah, she will contact you probably if she has more. But yeah, Janina.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is so thought-provoking and inspiring. I was curious about sort of along the lines of the question that Edith asked about the individual differences in synchronization ability. Do you think there would be, in the context of second language learning, where oftentimes we learn the rules, so it's more declarative, right? Do you think explicit instruction before your tasks would attenuate these differences in the learning curve between the low and high synchronizers?
Yeah, I think so. Of course. Yeah, I think that then completely different mechanisms would arise, So I think that this kind of mechanism where you have it's very important to have a good synchronization between the motor and auditory cortex. I think it's very relevant when you have fluent speech and you really need to locate where the boundaries are. So it's very important that you very correctly align to where the boundaries of the word are, or where the exactly at the correct time, so that you can encode more clearly where which words are there. But if you give them information a priori, you are already helping them to tune to the correct time. Yeah, so they are already expecting some syllables, for example, to be the onset of words, and you are helping them. So probably in this case, the difference between high and low synchronizers would disappear.
Yeah, that would be my prediction too. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, Jorge had a question.
Yes, but I feel like Janina is holding out on a second question. You can go ahead and ask it.
I just have like a half-baked. I was curious, because you had such regular sequences of 3-word sentences. I just wonder like how performance would differ if you had like in real life. Sometimes there's different amount of words intervene between the non-adjacent dependencies. Yeah, I think like perhaps the patterns of your results would still be the same, maybe just a smaller effect or something.
I think this is very important, and this is something that we are going to do in the near future. We have planned to do some experiments on changing this, because one of the lines of research that I'm developing is related to temporal processing. So the different elements or the different mechanisms of temporal attention, because you have different types of temporal attention, which specifically are related to language learning. So it's very important to have this kind of modulations to really know exactly which specific mechanisms are related to this, in the sense that if you have always the same distance between the first and the last word, the kind of attentional mechanisms that you are putting into place are very automatic. So it's really the same rhythm all the time. So it's not the same as in natural language, where you have is a variable temporal information, but this is determined by the form that is expected. So for example, if you expect the plural, this is going to happen, but you don't know when exactly this is going to happen. This is going to be determined by the category of the word that occurs. So if this is the category of word that you are expecting to have the plural, for example, this is where you are expecting the plural. Yeah. So it's not something that is always the same one. So there are some mechanisms of temporal attention that are related to what is called the hazard function, which means that when you expect something, the more time is elapsed, the more your expectation grows that what you're expecting is going to happen. Yeah. So if you are expecting the bus to occur, to come, and it didn't come, the more time, elapses, the more you expect that this is going to happen, because it should come. Yeah. So this is the kind of attentional mechanisms that we think is probably related to language learning. And the only way to test that is to have this kind of manipulations in the material.
Yeah, this would be really fun. Yeah. I'm done. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right. So, well, thank you for the talk. It's great, and I think the part that interests me the most, or concerns me the most in terms of my work, and I think this is true for some of us here, is the generalization part, right? Like that was super cool stuff. I think I told you when I read the paper the first time, and it's very nice for us. It's very interesting because there's like, cross-linguistic influence and transfer and these kind of terms that we use are such a big thing for a part of language acquisition research, and especially non-native language acquisition. And this is like, oh, this is so cool. This is how neuroscientists think about this, right? And there's such a fresh take on it that I think is very interesting. I was thinking of the TMS data, right? And how you, it's very nice how with fMRI you detect the peak activation areas for where you assume the generalization phase is happening, and then you impair those areas temporarily and see if the rule transfer happens, right? And I'm just going to call that. But the thing is, like, I was wondering whether you could risk an interpretation beyond a vague term, like conveniently vague, and that's fine. Like involvement, right? Like, okay, we've detected some areas in terms of causal explanation. I mean, like, we've detected some areas that are involved in rule generalization, assumed, like operationalized as we learn a rule in this language, we apply it to this other language, right? So does the TMS data tell you about the rule extraction, the rule storing, or the detection of the analogy between the two languages, or the the application of the rule, right? Because you've impaired these areas after they have presumably abstracted the rule, right? So you see my point, really? Like you didn't impair this in between the first and second blocks, where you would assume that they've stopped learning and now they're going to extract it. You've impaired it once they presumably had the abstract category, and now they cannot apply it to the new rule. So, but I wonder whether you can make a distinction between, oh, have you like messed up their storage room of the rule? Have you messed up their ability to take that stored rule and reapply it to something else? Have you messed up their ability to recognize that this is a context where they can reapply the rule that they learned in the other context, etc. Right? You see what I mean? That's I think one of the things that I'm most interested in, right? Like, how does this recognition of a similar context happen? That you kind of like, oh, okay, this is somewhere where I can use the thing I learned that other time and reuse my knowledge, right? Yeah, so sorry, that was a long question, but.
Yeah, well, in this specific study here, I mean, I reshaped everything because I wanted to convey one idea. But in the original study, we had the hypothesis. What we really wanted to test was how is generalization occurring, with this hypothesis that we need to integrate the information about when something happens with the content of the dependency. So it's somehow you create some placeholders in time that correspond to where the rule should occur, and then here you fill this with information of the phonological form in the different languages that you learn. Yeah, so that was our hypothesis of how generalization occurs. So in order to test this, we had another experiment where we test this with an attentional task that has nothing to do with language learning. And that's how we interpreted our effect as an interference with the ability to integrate the information about the time where this information occurs with the content of this information. So our interpretation based on this other experiment was what we did was to interfere with the ability of the subjects to use this knowledge they had before to fill in with new information about the phonological forms of the rules. I mean, we were not interfering with the ability to extract the rule, because we saw that they were still able to learn and show the pattern of learning that as if it was the first time. So that we can say that we are not interfering with rule extraction. And our interpretation was based on that. But I agree with you, but that we don't know whether we were also, maybe interfering with some kind of a representation of the rule, if the representation is somehow related to that. We came to this interpretation or prediction or hypothesis of what we expected based on what is the role of the left parietal lobe in other in outside the language domain. And this area is related to the integration of different features outside the language domain. So that's why we thought that it could fit what we thought was the creation of an abstract representation in language.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think we have Vince. Yeah.
Do we have time for one more?
I mean, we have time for everybody who wants to stay.
Fair enough. Okay, well, first off, I'll just echo what everyone else has said. That was a really, really interesting talk and leaves a lot for us to consider. I wanted to follow up a bit on the individual differences stuff you were mentioning, particularly the one of the studies you presented where you looked at some functional connectivity while learning the rule, then looked at structural connectivity as well. Did you happen to take any functional connectivity at rest in that particular study? I might have missed that in your presentation. And I promise I'm going somewhere with this. I was just curious if you did.
No, we didn't. We didn't. We did it during the learning. We didn't look at rest.
Yeah. So I was curious, if some of these people who, looked like they were acquiring faster and their connectivity patterns seem to suggest that, would you potentially see that? Is there maybe predisposed to this a little bit? Is there some basal level functional connectivity patterns that might lend people better to recognizing and picking up these rules a bit faster? I asked that in part because there's been some work coming out in resting state EEG literature, for example, that shows, phase synchronization between regions at rest or regions of interest at rest between electrodes to correlate really nicely with someone's ability to pick up various rules of a language. I've seen various instantiations of that with MRI, but I was curious if that would lend itself well to anything you guys would be working on.
Yeah, actually, that's a point that that we want to answer at one point, because, and it's very difficult. Maybe using, as you say, the rest would, rest connectivity would be one way to answer this. I'm talking about the question of whether these are individual differences that are there. We don't know whether people are better because they were born like this. They simply have a better connectivity because the structural connectivity was better from scratch, or genetically determined, or whether maybe they have been better at language learning, and this has made them having greater stimulation of those pathways that when you look at their structural connectivity, this is why this is happening. And that would also explain why maybe when they are learning, they are also having a better connectivity. If you have it at rest, it would be interesting to see whether we see the same, whether the differences that we see between the groups at when they are learning are also visible when you look at the same networks just at rest. We don't know because we haven't looked at that. I'm thinking whether this would, it would be interesting, but it wouldn't also give this answer, an answer to whether this is something that is predetermined genetically or there from scratch.
That may have been a bad way to. I was just curious if there would be some sort of connection between them. And of course, when you're looking at people who are already bilingual, it turns into a bit of a chicken and egg problem. So maybe following it up with, I don't know, functionally monolingual participants might give you a better answer there. But
yeah.
Very interesting.
But it would be definitely interesting to compare what happens at rest with when they are learning. Yeah.
Great. Thanks a bunch.
All right. Thank you so much for the answers, Ruth, for taking the time to answer each question. Any other ones? Other closing ones? Okay, if that's all, I guess we should conclude here. Again, I'm echoing what everybody said. Thank you so much for a great talk. It's been a pleasure hosting you today, Ruth, and thank you everybody for your attention and great questions and discussion. And I think we should end here and probably continue our relationship through emails, and then hopefully we can host you in person at some point as well. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks a lot for the invitation and the discussion. Bye-bye.
Of course. Bye.